All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, February 24th. As I mentioned earlier this morning, it's Pink Shirt Day, so it's kind of a raising awareness about bullying. And so here I'm wearing a pink shirt. It was designed by an artist from the Urban Native Youth Association, which is a kind of a support, or well, not support, but association for Indigenous youth here in Vancouver, just a little bit over that way. So thank you for the shirt. It's very nice. Although they didn't give it to me, but thank you anyway. Let's see. Well, it almost sounded like they were sponsoring me, which they're definitely not. But anyway, Basil's here. Good morning. Adon is here. Good morning to you. Irina's here. Good morning. Michelle's here. Good morning, Michelle. Hadil is here. Good morning. And yeah, thanks very much. I think it's kind of cool. Right. So yesterday we had started talking about China, right? And we were kind of talking about some of the early dynasties that show up in China, because China has a very long history of dynastic succession, right? And so a dynasty is kind of a hereditary line of rulers, so a grandfather and a father and a son, and maybe it goes on for a number of generations, and then eventually they're overthrown by a different family, and that different family will create another dynasty and they will rule over China. And so China's got this kind of recurring history of, a group of hereditary kings or emperors, whatever you want to call them, and then they're defeated in sort of a military fashion by another family group, and then they'll form their own dynasty, right? And again, China's kind of interesting because this dynastic situation happens for almost all of their history, from when they sort of start developing intensive agriculture and sort of a complex civilization. And these dynasties go all the way until 1911, unbelievably. So I showed you this little graphic here in which there's lots and lots of information, but you can pretty clearly see that it's basically dynasty after dynasty, right? The Jia at the beginning, leading to the Shang, to the Zhou, to the Qin, to the Han, and so on and so forth. Again, all the way up until the Republic of China is declared in 1911, right? And then the People's Republic declared in 1949, I believe. So it's kind of a long history, but it's also one that's continuous. And it's kind of interesting because, again, imagine in Egypt, imagine if there were pharaohs ruling Egypt until 1911. Crazy, right? Crazy stuff. But here in China, they actually have that continuity through their history, which is really interesting. We said that the first kind of major states or civilizations were the Jia, the Shang, and the Zhou, right? And these are all groups of hereditary kings or emperors, or however you want to think of them. And you can see each dynasty lasts for, the Jia and the Shang last for about 600 years each, and the Zhou only for about 200 or so. But keep in mind, that's a few rulers, right? So if you're in power, if the Shang, for instance, if they're in power for 600 years, that's probably at least 15 kings or 15 emperors, right? So there's actually kind of a long history of Shang emperors and probably of Jia emperors or kings as well. We said that the Jia was originally thought to be kind of mythological, one that was made up by the Shang to justify their rule. But it turns out it's probably not made up. There's probably some basis to it, but we don't really have any writing from the Jia period, only from the Shang. So the only things we know about the Jia kings is what the Shang kings said about them. So, in terms of how perfectly factual it is, it's hard to know. But it seems that these Jia kings were in charge from kind of the earliest period of Chinese civilization for about 600 years. And they're kind of part of the story because when the Shang overthrew them, or when a Shang king sort of conquered all of what was then China, when they conquered them, they had to come up with this idea of why they were in charge. And the idea they came up with was this mandate of heaven, right? And so, how would you define a mandate? It's connected to elections, but it's not quite. That's not quite it. But you're right. It's often spoken about when people have elections. What's a mandate? Qualifications, not quite, but you're kind of in the ballpark. It's not a command so much. You're all kind of circling around it, which is good. Yeah, it's kind of the power to do something, right? And so if somebody's given a mandate to do something, that means they're given the power to do it. So sometimes a government will have an election because they want to do something big, they want to make a big change, and they say, we need the mandate of the people, right? We need the mandate to be able to go ahead and do this. And so they have an election, and so if they're successful in the election, if the people elect that group, then that government will say, okay, we've got the mandate, we've got the power to do that thing that we wanted to do, right? In that way it is, but really what they're doing is they're asking for the mandate. So the mandate is, in this case, is like the permission, right? They're asking people, what's a good one? Trying to think of an example in Canadian political history.
Yeah, a member of the parliament, when they suggest something and they ask for the mandate of the other members to accept it so they can do it, like a bill of rights.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, and it could be in that respect too, right? And so, yeah, you're asking permission, or you're asking for the power to do something, right? So, yeah, if I give Nicholas the mandate to go ahead and survey all of Columbia College secondary students in terms of, I don't know, what ice cream flavor they like best. Yeah, I give him that mandate, right? Nicholas, I'm giving you the power and the instruction to go and do this thing, right? And so here, the Shang Dynasty is saying that, the power or the permission to rule over the people, yeah, the Jia had that permission, they had that mandate, but then they weren't really behaving very well, they weren't being good kings, and so heaven has taken that mandate away from the Jia and given it to the Shang, and now the Shang can rule, right? So it's justification for their power. So they kind of make up this this explanation that has to do with heaven in order to justify their rule. And of course, that idea will continue further into Chinese history. Other dynasties will say the same thing. They're like, yeah, there were those other kings, but they lost the mandate of heaven. We have been given the mandate of heaven because we killed them with our swords, and now we are in charge. Right? We said the Shang was kind of one of the earliest dynasties of Chinese history, but also there was some technological stuff going on, right? The casting of these intricate bronze statues and bronze kind of containers. They invented their own calendar and mathematics. There's all sorts of religious things happening, which we'll hear about a little bit shortly. And good morning. And they invent their own script as well. And we said we can read those. Part of the script that we can read came from those oracle bones, right? These bones where people asked either the gods or the ancestors a question, and then the oracle would tell them the answer, right? And often, the tricky part about oracles is often they give you a cryptic answer. They give you an answer that's kind of a riddle that you have to figure out what it means, which is kind of an annoying thing about asking the oracle. They usually don't give you a straight answer. They give you a answer in a riddle, and you have to interpret it on your own. So we do know, again, having these oracle bones is useful because, again, we can start to read the thoughts that people actually have. And again, if you want to know what's important to a group of people, pay attention to what they ask the gods for, right? Those are the important things, right? You don't say, "Oh dear God, please let me get out of class 5 minutes early today." Right? That seems like a very sort of seems like you shouldn't be asking God to do you a favor just for that, right? You ask him for the big things, right? And so, yeah, when we see what questions people ask of the oracle and what they pray for, that tells us what's important to a people, right? Whether it's the rain or a good harvest or, sons or whatever kind of thing the people want, they will ask the gods for. And so we have that information from these oracle bones. And so here we get a little bit of an idea of what's important to these people, but also we see that ancestors are very important as well, because some of the questions put to the oracle are actually to the ancestors, right? People are asking their great-grandfather and their great-great-grandfather, what should I do, right? What's the best thing to do here? Will we be successful? How should we proceed? Right, and so this period here of the Shang, but particularly the Zhou and the Qin dynasties, are ones where kind of some of the foundational ideas of Chinese culture start to appear. And so it's just like in India, I mentioned, with the Indo-Aryans and the sort of indigenous Indians kind of mixing together the Brahmanic or the Vedic tradition, the Varna system. Those things start to sort of appear and form kind of a foundation for Indian culture and civilization. And so the same thing is happening here in China. The sort of basic building blocks for Chinese culture are being put into place in this period. We read this section of the textbook yesterday, and you told me a little bit about Zhou kinship feudalism, right? And so I'll just kind of jump here. And that was the idea that the Zhou king kind of put a bunch of his relatives in charge of different areas of the kingdom, right? And you were kind of allowed to do whatever you wanted. You could rule that area of the country however you so desired, as long as you were loyal to the Zhou king and, did what he said. And we said that this was a useful system for governing a large area of land, especially when most people are illiterate and there's really no way to communicate with large groups of people. So this feudalist system works pretty well, but over time, those family relationships drifted apart, right? And so I said, yeah, I might be the Zhou king, and Mulder might be a cousin of mine, and so I might put him in charge of that kingdom over there. But in 3 or 4 or 5 generations, our descendants aren't going to be that closely related anymore, not as closely as Mulder and I were. And so these kings, these individual kings, start to not really identify with the emperor or the sort of main Zhou king. They start to feel like, well, maybe I should be the boss around here. And so these states start fighting with each other, and we sort of enter into a warring states period. That goes on for a few hundred years. Lots and lots of wars happen until finally a Qin ruler manages to conquer all of those states and bring them all under his own control. But again, now they have to come up with sort of different ideas for governing, right? That Zhou kinship feudalist system, that didn't entirely work, right? It worked for a little while, but then the whole thing fell apart. And so the Qin emperors have to try to figure out a new way to organize their state so that it won't fall apart. And we'll see a little bit of that shortly. And that brought us to Confucius, right? And so he's a popular enough figure that I think at least most of us have heard his name before, even if we don't know anything about him, or maybe we haven't. Confucius's ideas are kind of they come out of the Zhou period, they come out of the Warring States period, but they won't really be incorporated into the Chinese state until later. But they're ideas that will, sort of get mixed into Chinese culture and the way that Chinese states are governed. Not really when Confucius is alive, unfortunately. He'll feel very unsuccessful in his life, but his ideas will be picked up later on. And they're still present in Chinese culture and education today, right? His ideas are still alive amongst some people. So, what I'd like to do is watch a little documentary that talks a little bit about the history of China in terms of the Zhou period and the Qin period and afterwards, but also focuses on Confucius and how his ideas kind of appear. So I'll ask you these questions. So here, how were the rituals that young Confucius practiced important to? Sorry, I'm just trying to do two things at once here. I'm just going to post these things in Microsoft Teams so everybody can have them. There they are. They are posted. Yeah, were they important to the Chinese worldview? How does it relate to two great cosmic forces? That's interesting. That's an idea of how the universe works. What benefit emerges from technological change in this period? They'll be talking about storage of grain. We'll learn about Taoists. And so, again, we've talked about sort of intellectual traditions like Buddhism and Jainism, Hinduism. Here we have Taoism, right? So they'll have these people who are thinking about the Tao and what the Tao is. What does Confucius think about the Taoist thought or the Taoist perspective? How does the Zhou dynasty influence Confucius? And what does Confucius discover within these ancient rites? That will make sense as we watch. So I've posted these questions and the link to the video in Microsoft Teams. And so online people, maybe what we'll do is we'll watch about 25 minutes of the video. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and see. I'm not sure how many questions we'll be able to answer at the end of 25 minutes, but we'll see how it goes, okay? So online people, the link is in Microsoft Teams, as is the questions. Watch 25 minutes, take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what we've seen, okay? And we'll do the same here. Okay, see you in a bit. Right. So maybe I'll start again. So this has been a pretty interesting examination so far, I think, of a little bit of Chinese history, a little bit of Confucian thought, and also we're hearing a little bit about Taoism as well. So let's kind of review what we've seen so far. So at the very beginning, Bethany, I think her name is, Bethany tells us that there are these rituals that young Confucius practiced. And what do these rituals have to do with? How do the Chinese think about their world and their universe?
They're like meditation.
They're what?
Like meditation.
Like meditation?
Yeah.
I don't think we heard anything about meditation.
No, but can we like say about them like meditation?
In what way?
Like in terms of believing,
In terms of believing?
relating like to anxiety or something.
Oh. I don't know.
Or asking for something like problem.
I'm not sure.
Problem.
Nicholas, what were you going to say?
It's about balance. Like, she mentioned about dragon and the phoenix, and are they fighting those natural supernatural beings, and humanity, their willing just fighting us to keep the balance, and that's how rituals work.
Right. So yeah, there's this. We hear that their universe is kind of conceptualized as a struggle between two things, right? Between the sky and the earth, right? The male and the female, the dragon and the phoenix, right? And these two forces are kind of locked in struggle for all eternity, basically, right? They're struggling, and humanity's job is to keep the balance, right? To keep harmony. And so based on the rituals that people perform in the temples and in their homes, that's what helps to keep these two forces kind of balanced and in harmony, right? And so he says, yeah, that those rituals would have been an important part of Confucius's childhood, but also a part of really all people's lives as they practice those rituals to sort of keep the universe in balance, right? To keep a balance between those two forces. Oh, I think I answered both questions. Oops. Or maybe you did, Nicholas. What was she telling us when she went down into that grain storage pit? She went all the way, poor woman, she had to go all the way down the ladder just to tell us that one thing. And what did she tell us when she got to the bottom of the ladder? Yeah, he used to work in terms of, like, he used to work as a bureaucrat keeping track of grain stores, but what else does she tell us? It's kind of something we already knew, but no, not yet. It has to do with agriculture and grain. Yeah, she basically says what we've talked about is that when people start to practice intensive agriculture, they start to grow more food than they can actually eat, and that gives people time to do other things, right? And I said that it allows them to practice other crafts like making pottery and raising chickens and all kinds of making jewelry and all kinds of different things. But it also gives some people the ability to learn to read and write and to spend time thinking about things, right? Things like the nature of existence and what's the universe like. And for Confucius, it's of course the question of how do we create an ideal society, right? He comes out of a period that is chaotic, right? Where there's a war every year, right? And states are constantly fighting with each other and taking each other over, and then the other one takes over you again, and back and forth every year, chaos, upheaval, confusion. And Confucius asks, how can we end this, right? How can we have a society that is stable and peaceful and just, right? So, also floating around when Confucius is forming his ideas are these Taoists. And what do the Taoists believe? They also say Tao in here, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if the consonants are similar in Chinese or what. I'm not sure why, but sometimes it's spelled Tao and sometimes it's spelled Dao, and I honestly don't know why that is. But what do these people believe? These Taoists. Or shouldn't interfere with it. Yeah, the universe kind of has has a way that it operates, right? The Tao is the way. The universe unfolds in a certain way, and what's the job of humans then, if not to interfere with it? Yeah, to comply with it, right? To abide by it, to live life in alignment with the Tao, with the way, with nature and then the nature of the universe, right? And again, if you're a Star Wars fan, this is probably something that George Lucas lifted from ancient mythology and religion. That's kind of how the Force works in Star Wars, right? The Force is this, well, it's this force, right? This thing that moves through all the universe, and it has a will, and the Jedi Knights try to live in alignment with the Force, and that comes, I think, potentially comes from Taoism. And the Taoists believe that the universe has a way and a will, and humans need to, if they can quiet their mind and sort of connect with nature, they can live in alignment with the Tao, right? And so society is kind of an artificial thing that humans create that is actually in conflict with the Tao, which you could probably argue is not entirely wrong, right? If you think of many of the societies we've created today, they are actually in conflict with nature, right? We've paved over nature, right? We've cut down nature. We've polluted nature, right? And so the way we live our lives, a Taoist might argue, is very much in conflict with the way of nature, right? With the way of the Tao. We're actually kind of, yeah. So I think there's maybe something to be said there. But what does Confucius think about the Taoist view? Yes.
So you said like humans have to live in alignment.
Humans have to live in alignment with the Tao, with the way. Yeah. So with the sort of the manner in which the nature and the universe operates. So we should not, we're not trying to fight nature. We're not trying to conquer nature. We're not trying to change nature. We're just trying to live in alignment with it, sort of thing. Yeah, so what does Confucius think of that whole idea? Yeah, he doesn't believe it at all, right? He hears it and he's like, pfft, right? Pfft, whatever, right? He doesn't believe that. Why does he not believe? Why does he not agree with these Taoist ideas? Yeah, he says, yeah, like if we're just supposed to live in alignment with the way, in alignment with the Tao, then how come we're not doing that now? And it also just makes people powerless, right? He's like, well, then I'll just be powerless to do anything because I just have to live in alignment with the way, and there's nothing to be changed. There's nothing to be improved, right? There's no ability for humans to create something better. That's kind of what Confucius is coming from, right? He wants to create something better. He wants to create a better society. And so the Taoists are saying, no, abandon society and just live in harmony with nature. And Confucius is saying, that's ridiculous. We already live in a society, and we can make it better. We can do things. And in fact, he says that we have done so before, right? Because he's looking back to the Zhou dynasty, and what does he see in the Zhou period? That's number 6. What does he see in the Zhou period? Yeah, how to rule peacefully. What else does he see? Yeah, he kind of borrows. He tries to take those early Zhou rituals and kind of bring them into the present. He does that. What does he see in the Zhou period? What's that? Nope. Well, the mandate of heaven was around, but that's not what Confucius saw. Say again? No. He sees, when he looks back at the Zhou, he sees kind of a golden age, right? He kind of sees an age in which everything was perfect, right? And everything, the Zhou the rulers were kind and just. He thinks of that, or he imagines that example of the Duke of Zhou, where his brother is killed, and instead of seizing power for himself, the Duke of Zhou kind of rules until the king's son is old enough, and then he hands over power to the king's son in a very noble, selfless sort of gesture, right? And so he kind of looks back and he sees, we're in this warring states. We're in this warring states period. Messaging. We're in this warring states period, and everything is chaotic, and everyone's fighting with everyone else. But before that, there was a period of harmony. There was a period of order. There was a period of peace. How do we get back to that, right? Or how do we take that period and bring it into the present? How do we have that same peace and stability that the Zhou dynasty had? And again, whether it was actually that way or not is another story. Often people imagine the past to be much better than it was, right? There's a golden age of everything where people think the past was so great, and maybe in some ways it was, and maybe in some ways it wasn't. But he kind of wants to bring that forward, right? How do we create another golden age now based on what came before, right? And so what does he kind of come up with? What is his kind of idea? In a way, yeah, right? He takes those rituals and he turns them into kind of rules of etiquette and behavior, right? And how to interact with other people. And so does he start at the top of society with the government? No, he starts at the bottom, right? With regular people. If you want a better society, then you change yourself, right? You change how you interact with other people and what you do and how you think, right? And if everyone does that, then we'll have a better society, right? To the point where it seems like Confucius has rules for everything, right? They say he won't sit on a mat unless it's perfectly straight, right? There's a description of him walking in such a way that is like, it's almost like this perfect gliding walk, right? And his robes are perfectly, arranged, and they move perfectly on every side of him. And so he's very particular. You shake hands, and you shake hands twice and say hello, and then that's it. You don't say hello more than once, right? And so almost everything is very, like, he's got rules for everything, how to do everything. Which is interesting. There's a saying, I don't know who the saying is by, but they say how you do something is how you do everything. Right? So it's like if you're sloppy or careless, or if you just do a quick job at something and you don't really worry about it, then that will kind of carry over into other parts of your life. And so if you do one thing sloppy, that means you'll probably wind up doing everything sloppy, right? And so Confucius is like, yes, do everything, if you're careful and conscious of everything you do, that will sort of spread through society, and then everybody will be careful and conscious of what they're doing, right? We'll have a peaceful, stable society if everyone starts small and pays attention to the small things. Then the big things will kind of take care of themselves, I think. I'm not an expert in Confucius, but that's kind of what I read from him. Is there anything else you've noticed in this video so far that you want to talk about or mention, or things that you thought were interesting?
This idea of not letting develop anyone, which I think is has influence on modern day China, and how everyone is a slave to the government because they don't ask for their rights.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting to think about, and I don't know Chinese culture well enough to answer the question, but it's interesting to think about how these foundational layers, these sort of foundational beliefs of Chinese culture are passed down through the generations, and how they've kind of come to interact with communism, because the modern Chinese state is a communist one, and those ideas are borrowed from Karl Marx, who's writing in Germany in the 1800s. But it's kind of interesting to think about, how those ideas come into contact with each other, and how certain aspects of Chinese culture might actually support the rule of communism, right? Like, for instance, the Americans are very anti-communist and anti-socialist. And they are because, of course, they were locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union for decades, and so there's a legacy of that. But also, the Americans are very individualistic, right? Whereas communism or socialism is about the collective, right? About the state. Everybody works for the state, and the state sort of serves everyone equally. But the Americans are not about that, right? The Americans are about getting ahead and everybody doing whatever they want, and freedom and America, right? So it's interesting to think about how the Americans' kind of core values really conflict with communism. They don't really align at all. But it is interesting to think about how some of these things might actually support a communist state, right? And in terms of, the sort of social harmony that Confucius is sort of arguing for, is also very much in alignment with the communist state, where everyone just, do your duty, do what you're supposed to do, don't cause a fuss, and then we'll have harmony, right? And it's almost like some of the things we've heard here, that idea of harmony and order and stability are also things that communist states promise. Whether they deliver them is another story. But those are the kind of things that on paper that they promise. But contrast that with the US, where it's not so much about harmony and order, it's more about individual pursuit and competition and freedom and doing whatever you want. There's a very different kind of worldview that these two cultures have. And again, I'm no expert on China, but it is interesting to think how these sort of lower levels of kind of belief and values in Chinese culture have been, how they kind of connect with the communist government that currently exists. And again, I'm no expert, but it's interesting to think about. Anything else that we should say?
The meaning of the Buddha is mentioned above. They have the same ideas and what values
as Buddha. Yes. So this video is a bit of there's a 3-part series, right? And so one is on Buddha, one is on Confucius here, and there's another one on Socrates. And Bethany's point here is that, at this one period in history, it's kind of a coincidence, but I think it's a coincidence anyway, but there's one period in history where all these 3 guys are kind of around within about 100 years of each other, and they're all kind of asking questions about the nature of human existence, right? What is our life? How should we live it? And how do we live together in a society? And they're all kind of asking those questions, but they're all kind of answering them in different ways, right? And the Buddha is answering that question in one way, Confucius answers it differently, and then Socrates, who's a Greek philosopher, he answers it yet another way.
This is like the way they were living as kingdoms and rulers, where they have Muslim justice and they want to improve and like sometimes the beginning is like change something and start from the beginning. So like they have the same idea of people having the same situation where they want to change the community and the world.
It's possible. Like according to the story, they're all kind of motivated differently, and so we know that Buddha is, young Siddhartha Gautama is motivated by his realization that, oh gosh, all human life is suffering, and then you die. Awful. What can we do about that, right? Here we can see Confucius is living in a time of kind of political upheaval and warfare, and he asks himself, how can we put an end to all of this? How can we live in a stable, peaceful, just society, right? Socrates is living in a period in which Athens is becoming a very powerful, rich city in the Greek world. And so there's lots of wealth, there's lots of riches, there's lots of interesting developments like democracy happening in Athens. And Socrates is asking the same thing, like how should we run our society? How should we understand our world, right? And so they're all kind of coming out of slightly different contexts. They're all being kind of motivated by different things, and they come up with each one comes up with different answers, but they're all kind of asking the same question. And again, I think, Mulder, you made that very perceptive comment yesterday about it's almost a hierarchy of needs situation. So once these societies sort of stabilize and are wealthy enough to provide themselves with food and are secure, then they start asking bigger questions, right? Who are we and where do we come from and how do we live together? And so it's interesting that these 3 thinkers are asking those questions, but it's also very interesting that they're asking them almost at the same point in history, which again I think is a bit of a funny coincidence is all it is, but it's noteworthy that these guys are thinking about this.
In our modern days, in each country that has been organized as a war or any sort of conflict kingdom, they always aim for peace. That's why they're missing. Because that's mostly the same situation for everybody. That's not
I think that's very true, right? So all countries who are embroiled in conflict are, everyone who's engaged in war wants peace, right? Which I think is true. But I think these guys are asking a bigger question, right? So, peace is not just the absence of war, right? They're asking not only for peace, but for, what is a good way to live? What is a just society? how can we create a situation where people aren't suffering?
I'm not saying they are looking for peace. I'm saying that if they are having the same situation, they must have the same idea. I don't know if it's sort of coincidence.
Hmm.
It's about how they live.
Well, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, and the only, I guess, the only issue with that is maybe Socrates, because Socrates isn't. Well, actually, let's see. When is Socrates living? Yeah, Socrates is living in Greece in a period where there isn't a lot of obvious conflict. The Greeks are kind of scrappy and they like to fight with each other anyway. That's just how that history goes. They are almost invaded by the Persians twice, and so there's that to deal with. Although the Greeks, the Athenians beat the Persians both times, but Socrates isn't really living in an age of conflict so much. He's kind of living in a golden age of Athens himself. So, here Confucius is, looking back to a golden age, saying why can't we have one again? Socrates actually happens to be living in a golden age of Athens. And then the Buddha is, I don't know if he's living in a golden age, but he's certainly living in a golden lifestyle as a prince until he gives it up. Excuse me. Whew. It's not COVID, it's just a sneeze. So, kind of cold in here actually. So I think it's interesting that the three thinkers are kind of around and asking similar questions. I don't know that they necessarily come from a similar background, but I think it's true when people, are living in a state of society where things aren't great and people are suffering. I think it's natural to ask, how can we fix this, right? How can we return to a peaceful, productive situation where people aren't suffering, right? I think that's probably reasonable to say. I think, and again, it makes sense for all of them except for Socrates, because he's living in terms of Athenian history. Socrates is living in a pretty good time. Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple more questions that I'd like to ask you before we continue on, and I'll just sort of put them up on the screen here so you can see them. I didn't put them in a slide here. Hang on, that's not what I want to do. No. Yeah, these are the ones I want you to focus on in the next part here. So one of them is, how does Confucius feel about music? Not what are his jams, but how does he feel about music? Confucius will arrive at a mission. He'll come to some sort of clear idea about what he wants to do. He'll talk a little bit about the father-son relationship in Chinese culture, and he will try to extend that to the ruler of the state. He'll talk about how he selects his students, and he'll apply this idea to governing a state. How do Confucius's students sharpen their intellectual skills? The most difficult virtue to attain, but how does one attain it? And finally, how do Confucius's ideas finally become popular? Because, spoiler alert, they don't at first. So we probably won't have a time to watch all of this, but let's just watch. Online people will watch 10 more minutes, okay? So for the online people, I'll turn you loose. These questions are in Microsoft Teams, so you can see them. But for online people, I'll end the stream now, but watch 10 more minutes of it, and then we'll talk about some of these when we come back tomorrow, okay? So, yeah, 10 more minutes. See you tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon. And we'll do the same in class here. Okay, bye-bye.